I'd like to thank Pat and the organisers for shining a light on the issue of race and drugs. This, I'm going to suggest to you, is a source of profound injustice, yet is one that we find incredibly difficult to talk about, let alone to do anything about. And I think, I was going to say that there are good reasons for this, and when I was rehearsing this in my head, I caught myself and said, actually, I don't think the reasons are good. What I mean is, this is a form of motivated avoidance. That what I want to suggest to you is that race and drugs are both dumping grounds for the things that we don't want to think about. The psychoanalyst Michael Rustin, I think, puts this beautifully when he says that race is both an empty category, in the sense that it has really no meaning in biological fact, and one of the most destructive and powerful forms of social categorization. He goes on to say that indeed it is the emptiness of the construct that gives it its power, because its emptiness means we can project anything we want onto and into it. And he says, when we think about race, and we do so in ways which are emotionally loaded, that this is akin to a psychotic state of mind. And what he means by that is we are detached from reality. Most of the time when we think about race, we are insane. We are detached from reality. And I think we can make the same point in relation to drugs. Drugs, I think, are an empty category which invite us to project all kind of fantasy and anxiety into them. So the combination of race and drugs is a toxic one, and then when you throw policing into it, it becomes explosive. I'm going to talk primarily about stop and search, and I'm going to try and tell you really a story of 3 reforms which are rooted in the UK. So stop and search has been central to what's been described as a cycle of crisis and reform that has engulfed British policing since 1980. 1981, the Brixton riots, followed by the Scarman report, really marked a watershed in the modern history of British policing. The riots were described, the riots or the uprising, depending on who you listen to, were described by Lord Scarman as essentially an outburst of anger and resentment by young black people against the police. And he identified Swamp 81, a mass stop and search strategy, as being the primary trigger of that disturbance. And his solution was to emphasise the doctrine of policing by consent, which was incorporated into the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which has become the regulatory basis of stop and search. Fast forward, Stephen Lawrence inquiry. Stephen Lawrence, a teenager who was murdered in 1993 by what the inquest described as an entirely unprovoked attack by a group of white racists. The inquiry identified stop and search as being one of 4 specific areas where there was evidence of institutional racism within the British police force. And it recommended that the system of regulation that we had, which involved police officers recording any stop and search and giving a copy of that record to the person stopped and searched, be extended to what was called stop and account. This is a stop which falls short of a search. And I'll come on to that reform a little later. More recently, of course, the English riots, 2011, and what this shows is, this repeated cycle shows that really we haven't got to grips with the issue. The issue is repeating itself and being perpetuated over time. These reforms and their impact are evident in the number of stop and searches which are being done, so increased hugely up until the late 1990s. Then immediately after the Lawrence inquiry, we saw a dip, and then we saw a climb again up to a record in 2010-11 of 1.2 million stops and searches in England and Wales. This talk that I'm going to give used to fit really nicely into 20 minutes, and then you see that massive decline at the end. So now it's going to be fast and furious. It's going to be a little bit bumpy. Hopefully, maybe buckle up. We'll see how we go. So the research that I did on Recommendation 61, this could have been seen as a relatively routine extension of what the police were already doing. That is to say, it was conceivable within current practice. But that's absolutely not how it was experienced by the police. The police experienced this reform, and particularly the finding of institutional racism, as they would describe it, an attack on the integrity of the police force. And the analysis that I did after talking to a lot of police officers, my conclusion was that they experienced this as a form of trauma, and they collectively responded to trauma in the way that people do. They exercised all kinds of defence mechanisms which protected them from having to engage with the reality of what the Stephen Lawrence inquiry had identified. And just as an example of this quote from Sir Ian Blair, who was the former Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police, this was on the 10th anniversary of the publication of the Lawrence inquiry, and he said, "Anybody who had read the Macpherson report would recognise an institution that was treating people in a very monochrome way. I don't necessarily believe there was anything racist about the activities of the Metropolitan Police in relation to the Lawrences. What the investigators did was they treated the Lawrences as they treated a whole range of working class people, and they just did not understand the expectations and experiences of the black community. That is what has changed." Actually, I think the quote itself is evidence that that hadn't changed. 10 years after the event, this was evidence that the police organisation had still failed to come to grips with the issue, was still in defensive mode. And what I want to suggest is that set of attitudes, that defensiveness, provided the psychological basis for a pattern of resistance, whereby the police essentially undermined the reforms, undermined Recommendation 61, turned it into something other than what it was intended. And this was part of a broader process that we saw over the following decade of the police gaining more and more power with less and less accountability. So the due process protections that were put in place were rolled back. And not only did we see, so 10 years after the Lawrence inquiry, not only were we in the situation where we had more stop and search than we'd had before the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, it was also more disproportionately focused on black and minority ethnic groups than it had been. So if we look here, essentially what you see is the pattern for white people is we saw a reduction in stop and search, and that reduction was largely maintained over the decade. What we saw for black communities was something very different. We see an initial drop, but then it increases substantially towards the end of the decade, so that disproportionality had become much more marked. And what I think this indicates to us is that the police were caught in the basic assumption of fight or flight. They simply refused to engage with the reality of what was happening in the way that stop and search was being used. Drugs were a central part of this story. That drugs were a increasing focus for stop and search. So towards the end of the decade, we were in a situation where 50% of all stop and search was for drugs, and that increase was primarily at the expense of stop and search for stolen property. So this was very much a policy decision by the police to go after drugs. We see that very clearly when we look at the stop and search rate compared to the recorded number of crimes. When we compare the recorded number of drug crimes to self-reported drug use, what we can see is this increased focus on drugs had very little to do with patterns in drug use and was absolutely the result of police policy. I should say that of the recorded drug offences by the police, nearly 3/4 of them are for cannabis possession. Okay? And this really highlights the importance that cannabis reform played in this surge in stop and search. So I don't know if you remember back in 2004, cannabis was moved from Class B to Class C. Along with that, we had a new disposal called the cannabis warning, which crucially counted as a sanction detection, although it didn't count as part of your criminal record. This was supposed to lead to a situation where the police focused resources on drugs that cause most crime, or most harm. What it actually did was the opposite of that. What it actually led to was a net widening effect where we saw a massive increase in the police pursuit of cannabis offences. I think there were two reasons for that. Firstly, this was an unwanted reform by the police, that if we think about policing, it's the maintenance of order through the exercise of moral authority. One of the prime ways in which the police exercise moral authority is by cracking down on drugs. Therefore, cannabis reclassification was seen as a challenge to the very function of policing. The second thing was, by making cannabis warnings a sanction detection, we'd effectively incentivised the police to chase cannabis, because you can issue a cannabis warning in about 20 minutes, half an hour. Most other police activities will take you a lot longer, not least because there's a whole heap of paperwork that you have to do. So essentially, this was a fast track to hitting targets that were being set for the police. But again, was part of a broader process of defiance. I haven't said anything yet about race. So where's race in this story? And this was something that myself and Niamh Eastwood from Release were very interested in. We did a specific piece of work called The Numbers in Black and White to really look at the role that race was playing in relation to drug stop and search. And the starting point really was to look at levels of drug use. This is taken from the Crime Survey of England and Wales, a pretty familiar finding, which shows that people from black and minority ethnic groups generally use drugs at a lower rate than white people, and that's true pretty much across the categories of different kinds of drug. So that any increased focus can't be explained as a result of drug use. Yet what we see is a massive disproportionality in the use of stop and search. What we found is that the stop and search for drugs is higher than the stop and search generally. So drugs is one of the primary drivers of disproportionality in relation to stop and search per se. What we also find is that disproportionalities in relation to stop and search are not only important in and of themselves because they are a source of embarrassment and humiliation and social exclusion, they also have very significant knock-on consequences in terms of other disposals further down the line. So the disproportionalities that are evident in relation to stop and search are carried through in relation to warnings, to fines, to cautions. Charges, the disproportionality increases even further, and that might be evidence of implicit bias. It might be evidence of feedback effects, whereby if you're known to the police already for an offence, you're more likely to get charged further down the line. If you're black, you're more likely to be known to the police because you're more likely to be stopped and searched. Then we had the riots. The riots kind of changed a lot. Didn't change everything, changed a lot. What we've seen since the riots is this massive decline in stop and search, which is evident across all ethnic groups. The level of decline is about the same across all ethnic groups, which in some senses is good news because it means that black people have shared in the reduction in stop and search. In some ways it's bad news because we still have the same level of disproportionality that we've pretty much always had. What I also want to suggest to you is that the link from the riots to the reduction in stop and search was not inevitable and it was not automatic. That Theresa May in the immediate aftermath of the riots was talking in the traditional law and order type rhetoric. It could have led to greater use of police powers. The fact that it hasn't is down to a lot of things. I don't know exactly what it's down to. I think it's complicated, but I think campaigning has played a role in this process. So I'm part of an organisation called Stopwatch, which campaigned specifically around stop and search. We got together in 2010 because we were concerned that the gains from the Lawrence inquiry were being rolled back. Amongst our aims were we wanted to see a 50% reduction in stop and search over 5 years, and we wanted to see the elimination of disproportionality. We've done a number of things. So we're a broad-based coalition which includes stakeholders from many different areas. We try to have a flat hierarchy which recognises various different kinds of expertise. So we're made up of people from civil society, lawyers, academics, activists, people from impacted communities. And the ethos is that actually when we come together, we're much stronger than when we work apart. We mounted a legal challenge against Section 60 of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act. We lost the battle. That case has failed at every stage of British justice, but arguably we won the war because the use of Section 60 has fallen off a cliff. We've seen a 95% reduction in the use of that power over the last 5 years. One of the other things that we have done is try to challenge the dominant narrative around stop and search. The dominant narrative around stop and search before the riots was we need to minimise the amount of bureaucracy on the police, we need to cut the red tape in order to allow the police to get on with the job of fighting crime. What we tried to do was to make race much more central to the conversation, to the narrative, because it was absent, and we've done that in various ways. One of the ways is working through the media, and we've had some success with that. And I think we have seen the narrative transform. So this is actually astonishing to me still. So this is an extract from a debate where Theresa May announced the findings of the HMIC review into the use of stop and search. If I may just read some of it to you. The Secretary of, bear in mind these are all Conservative politicians. The Secretary of State for the Home Department, Mrs. Theresa May. Nobody wins when stop and search is misapplied. It is a waste of police time. It is unfair, especially to young black men. It's bad for public confidence in the police. It goes on, Michael Ellis. Do not the figures indicate that sadly in a large number of cases it is nothing but the colour of the skin of the person being stopped that has caused the stop and search to happen? Mrs. May. I'm sorry to say that my honourable friend is right. Given that a black person is 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched than a white person, one can only assume that it is the fact that the person is black that leads to the stop and search taking place. Disgraceful. It is absolutely disgraceful. Richard Fuller. This is probably the worst form of legal racial abuse in our country. So this was an extraordinary moment of official recognition of what has been going on for 30 years. I think the fact that we had a Conservative government pushing the reform agenda is a big factor in explaining why we've seen a potentially long-term, massive reduction in the use of stop and search in a way that wasn't maintained after the Macpherson report. Because what happened after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry was that the Conservative, then opposition, basically colluded with the police and gave the police a very clear message that you don't need to worry about this. They basically said that Macpherson had helped to label every police officer in England and Wales a racist. That said, we're not out of the woods. What I want to suggest is that there are risks that go along with the kind of public humiliation that Theresa May and colleagues have engaged with in relation to the police if it's not supported by containment. I think the difficulty that we face is how do we get white people and white organisations to face the real issue in a way which recognises their anxieties around it. So, Michael Rustin, from a psychoanalytic perspective, says, racism as a system of distortion and lies can be successfully fought only through a commitment to the truth concerning both inner and outer realities. What I think this means is we need to attend to the outer reality of disproportionate, discriminatory use of stop and search. But we need to do it in a way which takes account of the inner reality, which is that police are likely to experience this as a form of trauma, are likely to be very defended against this, and are likely to resist it. How we solve that conundrum is something that we're still thinking about, but I think there are huge clues in the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa that this was the result of a political struggle which pushed the white minority into confronting the viciousness and discrimination of the system, but it did so in a way which recognised their humanity. And I think through recognising their humanity, there was an element of containment which enabled that process to take place. I think there are huge lessons for us in relation to how we address the issue of racism in this country in relation to policing and indeed many other areas as well. Thank you very much.